we mistake noise for power. We live in a world that insists we must scream our value from the rooftops, that we must build monuments to our own achievements just to be seen, just to be counted. But the deepest truths of who we are do not belong to the theater of public validation. Your worth is not a negotiation, nor is it a prize to be won in the marketplace of approval. It is an internal architecture, built softly, stone by deliberate stone, in the way you hold your ground when the wind demands you bend. It is found in the quiet elegance of your boundaries, in the sacred spaces you refuse to let others trample, and in the devastating dignity of your silence when an explanation is beneath you. People are watching, not the spectacle you put on, but the quiet gospel of your conduct. They are learning how to treat you by witnessing exactly what you will tolerate, what you will celebrate, and what you will simply walk away from without a backward glance. Let us speak today of that wordless instruction, the 7 quiet, unmistakable behaviors that do not beg for respect, but command it. We operate under a collective delusion that to be valued, we must first be loud. We have been conditioned to believe that if we do not broadcast our merits, if we do not constantly narrate our efforts and demand our seat at the table, we will remain invisible. Yet, the most enduring structures in this world do not announce their presence. They simply endure. The first and perhaps most foundational behavior that teaches people your worth is the profound realization that your value does not require a press release. When you understand your intrinsic weight, you stop auditioning for the approval of others. You stop treating every interaction as a courtroom where you must defend your right to exist, your right to be respected, or your right to be heard. There is a distinct, unmistakable authority in the person who does not scramble for validation. When you perform excellent work, when you hold a deep and unshakable integrity, or when you extend kindness, and you do so without immediately looking around the room to see who noticed, you shift the gravity of the environment. The world is deeply accustomed to people begging for attention, so when it encounters someone who is entirely self-contained, it is forced to pause. This quiet demonstration of self-worth creates a magnetic curiosity. People begin to realize that you are not motivated by their applause, which means you cannot be controlled by their criticism. Your value becomes a fixed point, not a fluctuating currency dependent on the market of public opinion. Furthermore, this silence is not passive. It is an active preservation of energy. When you constantly try to explain or prove your worth to people who are committed to misunderstanding you, you inadvertently grant them power over your peace. You are essentially telling them that their assessment of you matters more than your own. By choosing instead the path of quiet demonstration, you establish a boundary that words could never enforce. You let your consistency, your character, and your labor speak the language of your value. It is the steady, rhythmic accumulation of your daily choices. How you show up, how you treat the vulnerable, how you handle failure when no one is looking, that ultimately composes the truth of who you are. This is the power of the unspoken. It shifts the burden of recognition away from you and onto the observer. You are no longer asking them to see you. You are simply existing in your full stature, leaving them with no choice but to adjust their gaze. The second behavior that quietly dictates your value to the world is the architecture of your boundaries, specifically the sacred, unapologetic utility of the word no. We often treat boundary setting as a hostile act, a jagged fence topped with wire meant to keep humanity at bay. Because of this, we compromise, we bend, we stretch, and we fracture ourselves into shapes that fit other people's comfort, terrifyingly afraid that a refusal will be interpreted as a betrayal. But the truth is entirely reversed. A boundary is not an act of aggression. It is a profound act of clarity. It is the moment you gently but firmly sketch the outline of your own landscape, letting others know exactly where your territory begins and where their license to tread ends. When you lack the courage to say no, your yes becomes entirely meaningless, a cheap currency inflation born of fear rather than a deliberate offering of your time, your intellect, or your grace. When you deliberately protect your margins, you send an immediate, wordless signal that your life possesses a rhythm and a purpose that cannot be hijacked by passing whims. The person who says yes to every demand, every toxic dynamic, and every late-night imposition is teaching the world a dangerous lesson, that their time is a public commodity, free for the taking and devoid of inherent cost. But when you look at a request that diminishes your peace or exploits your labor, and you decline it without embarking on a frantic marathon of justifications and apologies, you shift the dynamic entirely. You do not need to deliver a lecture on why your time matters. The clean finality of your refusal carries all the weight required. It announces that your energy is a precious, finite resource that must be managed with absolute stewardship. This behavior forces a fundamental reevaluation from those around you. People are naturally inclined to take as much as the space allows, but they quickly learn to respect a container that refuses to leak. When they realize that your compliance cannot be bought with guilt and that your presence must be earned through mutual regard, their behavior shifts. They begin to bring their best selves to the table because they know the entry fee to your space requires reciprocity. You are quietly teaching them that you respect yourself far too much to become a casualty of their convenience. This quiet containment creates a dignity that words can never replicate, establishing an invisible standard that compels people to pause, to think, and to treat your presence with the deliberate care it deserves. The third behavior is perhaps the heaviest, the most absolute declaration of self-worth a human being can make, the quiet, devastating dignity of walking away. There is a deep, agonizing trap in staying to fight for a place at a table where you were never meant to sit, or where your presence is merely tolerated rather than celebrated. We often mistake endurance for strength. We convince ourselves that if we just argue a little longer, if we just explain our intentions a bit clearer, or if we suffer through the disrespect with enough patience, we will eventually convince the other party of our value. But you cannot negotiate your worth with someone who is committed to diminishing you. When you stay in an environment that extracts your peace, insults your intelligence, or treats your loyalty as a given, you are inadvertently agreeing with their low assessment of you. You are participating in your own reduction, walking away without an argument, without a grand theatrical exit, and without a bitter war of words is the ultimate act of self-sovereignty. It is the realization that your energy is far too sacred to be spent on a defense budget. When a room, a relationship, or an institution repeatedly signals that it does not see you, the most powerful response is not anger. It is absence. Anger is still a form of investment. It tells the other side that they still hold emotional real estate in your mind. It shows them that their opinion of you has the power to disrupt your equilibrium. But when you simply close the door and step out into the open air, you reclaim your currency. You leave them alone with the space they refuse to honor, forcing them to look at the sudden cold vacuum where your presence used to be. This behavior teaches people your worth because it carries the weight of finality. It demonstrates that you possess a baseline of self-respect that is entirely non-negotiable. It signals that while you are generous enough to offer your time, your talents, and your heart, you are also strong enough to survive their loss. The world quickly learns that you are not a permanent fixture to be mistreated and taken for granted, but a visitor who stays only where there is mutual regard. By choosing the elegance of departure over the exhaustion of an endless conflict, you establish a standard that words alone could never enforce. You shift the gravity of the situation entirely, making it clear that you do not need their validation to stand whole, and that your willingness to leave is the truest metric of your personal power. The fourth behavior that silently establishes your value in the eyes of others is the profound internal discipline of keeping promises to yourself. We live in a culture that measures integrity almost exclusively by how we treat our external obligations, whether we show up to work on time, pay our debts, or fulfill our duties to our families and communities. While those external commitments are vital, we routinely commit a quiet, devastating treason against our own well-being. We make pacts with ourselves in the dark, promises to rest, to leave a toxic situation, to invest in our talents, or to protect our health, only to break them the moment an external demand or a fleeting distraction whistle for our attention. Every time you break a promise to yourself, you microdose your own psyche with the belief that you do not matter. You send a clear internal signal that your own boundaries, desires, and decisions are secondary, a luxury to be traded away at the first sign of inconvenience. This internal betrayal does not remain hidden. It leaks into the atmosphere of your daily life. When you do not honor your own word to yourself, you project an energy of availability and malleability that other people instinctively read. They realized, without you ever saying a word, that if you do not respect your own boundaries, they certainly do not have to respect them either. Conversely, when you cultivate the discipline to honor your internal covenants, an entirely different authority takes root. When you declare to yourself that you will dedicate an hour to your craft, or that you will no longer tolerate a certain tone of voice, and you follow through on that declaration when no one is watching, you build an unshakable internal core. You are no longer looking to the outside world to define the boundaries of your worth, because you have already anchored those boundaries deep within your own character. This self-fidelity fundamentally alters how the world interacts with you. People can sense the weight of a person who honors their own word. They recognize that your time is not a blank check they can write over at their leisure, because they see how fiercely you protect the commitments you have made to your own growth and peace. You teach them that your decisions are not open for negotiation or casual erosion. By making your self-respect an absolute, non-negotiable reality, you compel the people around you to treat your presence, your schedule, and your contributions with an equal degree of gravity. They learn that to gain access to your world, they must match the standard of integrity you already practice in the quiet, sacred solitude of your own life. The fifth behavior that instructs the world on the weight of your soul is the grace of composure, the absolute, unwavering refusal to let the frantic noise of your surroundings dictate the tempo of your internal pulse. There is a deep, intoxicating fallacy that authority must be loud, that it must brandish its power, stomp its feet, and demand the center of the room through sheer vocal volume or aggressive posturing. We see this theatricality everywhere, a desperate choreography of people trying to dominate spaces by filling every silence with clutter, assuming that to be quiet is to be forgotten. But true majesty is never frantic. True authority does not shout to be recognized. It possesses a dense, quiet gravity that forces the room to quiet down just to catch its breath. When you cultivate a presence that is calm, deliberate, and entirely unmoved by the manufactured emergencies of others, you alter the very atmospheric pressure of the space you occupy, establishing an invisible registry of respect before you have even uttered a single word. This composure is not a mask of indifference, nor is it a passive withdrawal from the world. It is the ultimate manifestation of internal restraint. It is the understanding that your peace is too heavy a treasure to be tossed about by the changing winds of someone else's chaos or insecurity. When you are confronted with hostility, with pettiness, or with the frantic demands of an environment that thrives on disorder, and your response is a measured, unhurried stillness, you expose the emptiness of the noise around you. You refuse to participate in the performance of panic. By holding your center, you present the world with an unyielding mirror that reveals its own unnecessary turbulence, forcing those who seek to disrupt you to confront their own instability. People who are accustomed to triggering reactions in others find themselves suddenly disarmed by your refusal to be rattled, realizing that they cannot manipulate a person whose anchor is buried far deeper than their storms can reach. This quiet containment teaches people your worth because it signals an immense, disciplined wealth of spirit that cannot be bought or bartered with cheap provocations. It demonstrates that you are the sole author of your own emotional climate, rather than a casualty of theirs. When you speak from this place of stillness, your words carry a distinct physical weight that commands an authentic listening. Because you do not squander your language on trivial battles, anxious explanations, or defensive posturing. Your voice drops into the environment like a heavy stone into a still pond, creating ripples that alter the thoughts of everyone present. You quietly teach the people around you that your presence is a stabilizing force, a rare and precious territory that will not be compromised or brought down to the level of common drama, compelling them to adjust their own behavior to match the dignified baseline you have, so carefully composed within yourself. The sixth behavior that quietly establishes your value in the eyes of the world is the intentional practice of selective accessibility. We live in an era that worships total, unmitigated exposure. We are told that to be relevant, to be successful, and to be liked, we must be perpetually available, ready to answer every call, reply to every message instantly, and grant access to our emotional and mental reserves at a moment's notice. We treat constant availability as a badge of honor, a sign of our usefulness and importance. But when you make yourself a public utility, open to anyone at any time for any reason, you inadvertently teach people that your presence carries no cost. You signal that your attention is a cheap commodity rather than a precious resource. True value is never found in overabundance. It is found in the deliberate, self-governing stewardship of your own proximity, in the deep understanding that your presence is a rare gift that must be rationed with absolute care. Choosing who gets across the threshold of your inner life is not an act of arrogance. It is an act of deep self-preservation. When you create a space of sanctuary around yourself, establishing that your attention, your wisdom, and your emotional energy are not free for casual plundering, you completely rewrite the terms of your relationships. You do not need to deliver a manifesto on why your time is valuable. The quiet boundaries of your availability carry that message for you. When you do not immediately drop everything to accommodate someone else's casual convenience, or when you choose to recuse yourself from environments that exhaust your spirit without replenishing it, you introduce an element of reverence into how people approach you. They begin to understand that an hour of your undivided attention or a place in your inner circle is not an entitlement, but a distinct privilege that must be met with equal gravity, respect, and care. This selective containment forces a fundamental shift in human behavior. People naturally treat a well-protected space with greater care than a wide open field. When they realize that your energy cannot be consumed thoughtlessly, and that you are entirely comfortable operating in your own solitude rather than settling for low-frequency interactions, their approach alters. They begin to bring their most deliberate, respectful selves to the table, because they know that sloppy behavior or emotional laziness will cost them their access to you. You are quietly teaching them that you respect your own intellect, your peace, and your limited time on this earth far too much to let it be squandered on things that do not honor your depth. By choosing to step back from the frantic cycle of constant availability, you allow your presence to regain its proper weight, transforming it from a common, overlooked expectation into a deliberate, highly valued offering that people must approach with conscious intentionality. The seventh and final behavior is the absolute coronation of the self. The moment you choose to crown yourself in your own truth and permanently revoke the world's license to assess you, we spend the better halves of our lives handing the ledger of our value over to strangers, to employers, to lovers, and to friends, begging them to tally up our virtues and tell us what we are worth. We allow our joy to be dictated by their compliments and our despair to be engineered by their critiques, turning our very existence into a frantic, ongoing public debate. It is an exhausting way to live, standing in the town square day after day, waiting for a jury of people who do not even know their own hearts to pass judgment on yours. But when you step out of that courtroom and decide that you are the sole and final authority on your own life, you dismantle the entire apparatus of external judgment. You transform your worth from a fragile hypothesis that needs to be proven into an undisputed elemental fact. This self-validation is not an act of hollow vanity or a loud, defensive shielding of one's flaws. It is a deep quiet settling into your own skin. It is the realization that the truth of who you are, your history, your scars, your secret triumphs, and your capacity to love is entirely interior, far beyond the reach of anyone else's vocabulary. When you validate yourself, you stop asking permission to occupy space. You stop tailoring your speech, your dress, or your dreams to fit the narrow expectations of an audience that will eventually change its mind anyway. You recognize that the gaze of the outsider is inherently flawed, always viewing you through the distorted lens of their own projections, envies, and limitations. By anchoring your worth in your own knowing, you create a profound immunity to the opinions of the crowd. A room cannot make you feel small if you have already measured your own vastness, and a critic cannot strip you of your dignity if you have already woven it into the fabric of your character. This behavior alters how the world approaches you because it eliminates the vulnerability that exploiters rely upon. When people realize they can neither inflate your ego with cheap flattery nor deflate your spirit with cold neglect, they lose their leverage. They see that you are not a canvas waiting for their paint, but a finished masterpiece that merely allows them to look. You teach them that your value is a sovereign territory, completely independent of their praise or their condemnation. By refusing to participate in the negotiation of your identity, you force those around you to accept you on the terms you have established, standing before them not as a question to be answered, but as a monument that simply exists